Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The morning air hung heavy with salt and humidity as Mark Callahan loaded his weathered pickup truck with fishing gear. At 39, Mark had spent most of his life on or around the waters of New Smyrna Beach, Florida. His father had been a fisherman before him, and his grandfather before that. The Callahan men belonged to the sea. It was simply in their blood. Mark's calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency, stowing tackle boxes, bait coolers, and his collection of rods in the truck bed. The sky was just beginning to lighten, streaks of pink and orange cutting through the fading night. It was going to be a scorcher, but the early morning hours would be perfect for casting lines. "You heading out already?" The sleepy voice of his wife, Diane, drifted from the back porch of their modest single-story home. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in a faded robe, coffee mug in hand. "Tide's coming in early today. Best fishing's gonna be before noon," Mark replied, securing a cooler with a bungee cord. "Promised Joe I'd be at the dock by 6. Diane nodded, taking a sip from her mug. After 18 years of marriage, she was well accustomed to Mark's pre-dawn departures. "Just be careful out there. The news said there's been more shark sightings than usual." Mark let out a dismissive chuckle. "There's always sharks, Di. Been fishing these waters my whole life. I know how to handle myself." He slammed the tailgate shut with a metallic clang. "Besides," he added with a wink, "those toothy bastards gotta eat too. Maybe I'll toss them. Some bait if they ask nicely." Diane didn't share his humor. "That's not funny, Mark. Remember what happened to Tim Dorsett last month? Tim was spearfishing way out past the breakers. Different story altogether." Mark walked over and planted a quick kiss on his wife's forehead. "I'll be careful. Promise. You better be. Don't forget we've got dinner at your sister's tonight." Mark nodded, already climbing into the driver's seat. "I'll be back with plenty of time to shower, hopefully with a cooler full of snapper." The engine roared to life and Mark backed out of the driveway, leaving Diane standing on the porch. As he drove away, he caught her figure in the rearview mirror, still watching him. A pang of guilt tugged at him. Maybe he shouldn't be so flippant about the sharks, but he'd spent his entire life coexisting with the ocean's apex predators. Respect them, yes, fear them. That was for tourists. The 15-minute drive to Callahan's Bait and Tackle passed quickly. The shop had been in Mark's family for 3 generations, now run by his younger brother, Joe. Though Mark had opted for the freedom of freelance fishing rather than taking over the family business, he still helped out when needed and maintained a small charter service on the side. Joe was already there, unlocking the front door when Mark pulled up. "About time," Joe called out, though Mark was 10 minutes early. The brotherly ribbing was as much a part of their routine as the fishing itself. "Had to wait for your lazy ass to get here and open up," Mark shot back with a grin. Joe laughed, flipping on the lights inside the shop. At 35, he looked like a younger version of Mark. Same sandy brown hair, though Joe's was already thinning on top. Same stocky build, honed by years of hauling gear and catches. "Coffee's already on," Joe said, heading behind the counter. "Forecast is good today. High-pressure system moving in, water temperatures perfect." Mark helped himself to coffee from the ancient pot that permanently occupied a corner of the shop. "Thinking of hitting the North Inlet. Word is the Reds are running thick there." Joe nodded approvingly. "Smart. Bobby Winston was in yesterday, said he limited out in 3 hours at that spot." They spent the next half hour preparing, checking gear and loading Joe's boat, a 24-foot center console that had seen better days but was meticulously maintained. It was larger than Mark's 18-footer, which was currently in the shop for engine repairs. By 6:30 a.m. they were pulling away from the dock, the engine's steady rumble cutting through the morning calm. The sun had fully risen now, casting golden light across the water's surface. A few other boats dotted the horizon, mostly locals who, like the Callahan brothers, knew the value of an early start. "So what's this I hear about Diane wanting you to sell your boat?" Joe asked as they cleared the no-wake zone. Mark grimaced. "Been a point of contention lately. Says we could use the money for Mikey's college fund. Kid's only 12, got plenty of time to save up." "That's what I said." Mark shrugged. "But she's got a point. Boat's just sitting there costing money with the repairs. Charter business hasn't been booming exactly." Joe shot him a sideways glance. "You'd go crazy without your own boat, besides family tradition and all that." Mark didn't respond immediately. The truth was, he had been considering it. Between the mortgage, Mikey's braces, and Diane's part-time teacher's salary, money was tighter than he liked to admit. But the ocean was where he felt most alive, most himself. The thought of giving that up, even partially, left an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they made their way to the fishing spot. Joe shared the latest town gossip, including the news that the Pearsons' daughter had gotten engaged to that weird kid with all the tattoos, and that the town council was once again debating parking regulations for the beach access points. They arrived at the North Inlet just after 7 a.m. The spot was exactly as Bobby had described, relatively calm waters with visible baitfish activity, perfect conditions. They dropped anchor about 50 yards from shore, where the channel created a natural pathway for fish moving with the tides. "This is going to be good," Joe said, already baiting his hook with a live shrimp. "I can feel it." Mark nodded, scanning the water. His eyes caught movement beneath the surface about 20 yards out, a large, dark shadow moving parallel to the shoreline. His pulse quickened slightly, years of experience telling him what it was before his mind fully registered it. "Got a bull cruising out there," he said casually, pointing toward the shape. Joe followed his gesture, squinting against the sun's reflection on the water. Big one too, probably 7-8 feet. Neither man showed particular concern. Bull sharks were common in these waters, especially in the inlets where freshwater met the sea. They were aggressive predators, responsible for more attacks on humans than any other species in Florida. But the Callahan brothers had grown up with them as a fact of life. "Let's just keep the catch in the boat and not in the water," Joe said, casting his line in the opposite direction of the shark. Mark did the same, and soon they were settled into the peaceful rhythm of fishing. For the next few hours, they had steady action, landing several respectable redfish, a couple of flounder, and a large snook that gave Mark a 10-minute fight before he could bring it aboard. Around 10 a.m. the heat had become oppressive, the sun beating down mercilessly. Both men were drenched in sweat, their shirts clinging to their backs. "Think we should call it?" Joe asked, reeling in his line. "Got plenty for the day already." Mark nodded reluctantly. While he'd have preferred to stay out longer, the heat was becoming unbearable, and they had indeed landed a good catch. As Joe started stowing the gear, Mark noticed something in the water behind the boat. His specialized cast net, an expensive piece of equipment he used for catching bait, had somehow come loose from its storage spot and fallen overboard. It was now drifting about 10 feet from the boat, half submerged and tangling on itself in the current. "Damn it," Mark muttered. "Net's in the water." Joe looked over the side. "Want me to grab the gaff?" Mark shook his head. "Nah, it'll just tear it. Water's shallow here, I'll just hop in and grab it." "You sure? We saw that bull earlier." "That was hours ago and it was headed the other way." "Water's clear, I can see the bottom." Mark was already kicking off his deck shoes. "It'll take 2 seconds." Before Joe could protest further, Mark swung his legs over the side and dropped into the water. It was about chest deep, refreshingly cool after the relentless sun. The sandy bottom felt firm beneath his feet as he waded the few steps toward the drifting net. "Hurry up," Joe called, nervously scanning the water around them. Mark reached the net and began gathering it, carefully untangling the weighted edges to prevent further damage. The task was taking longer than he'd anticipated. The netting stubbornly knotted around itself. That's when he felt it. A subtle shift in the water pressure against his legs, a whisper of movement that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. Years on the water had attuned him to these almost imperceptible changes. Something was approaching. He looked up sharply, instinctively searching the water around him. The sun's glare on the surface created blinding patches, making it difficult to see beneath. "Mark, 9 o'clock. Joe's voice held an urgency that sent adrenaline surging through Mark's system. He turned his head left, following Joe's direction, and saw it. The same bull shark they'd spotted earlier, or perhaps a different one, now moving directly toward him with purposeful speed. In that instant, Mark knew he wouldn't make it back to the boat in time. "Get the gaff!" he shouted to Joe, already backing away from the approaching predator, still clutching the net in his hands. The shark closed the distance with frightening efficiency, its powerful tail propelling it forward in a burst of speed. Mark had just enough presence of mind to thrust the tangled net toward the shark as it reached him, hoping to create some kind of barrier or distraction. The bull shark collided with the net, momentarily entangling itself in the mesh. It thrashed violently, its powerful body twisting and turning as it tried to free itself. Mark attempted to use this moment to retreat toward the boat, but his foot slipped on the sandy bottom, pitching him backward. In that crucial moment of imbalance, the shark tore free from the netting and lunged forward. Mark felt a crushing pressure as the bull's jaws clamped onto his right calf, its rows of serrated teeth slicing through muscle and tissue with horrific ease. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot explosion that sent shockwaves through his entire body. Water around him turned crimson as the shark shook its head violently. The instinctive behavior meant to tear chunks from prey. "Mark!" Joe's panicked voice seemed distant, muffled by the rushing of blood in Mark's ears. Through a haze of pain and terror, Mark remembered the one piece of advice that had been drilled into every coastal Florida child. If attacked, fight back. Don't play dead. Sharks respect strength. With his free leg, Mark kicked at the shark's sensitive gills and eyes, landing several solid blows. The shark released its grip momentarily, circling back for another strike. In that brief window, Mark lunged toward the boat, where Joe was leaning dangerously far over the side. Gaff extended toward him. The bull shark charged again, this time grazing Mark's side as he twisted away. He felt the rough skin, like coarse sandpaper, tear at his shirt and the flesh beneath, but the bite he expected didn't come. His hand found the gaff Joe was holding out, and with a surge of desperate strength, he pulled himself toward the boat. Joe grabbed his arm, hauling him upward as the shark made another pass. The next moments were a blur of movement and pain. Somehow, between Mark's frantic scrambling and Joe's pulling, he managed to heave himself over the gunwale and collapse onto the deck, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. Jesus Christ! Joe's face had drained of all color as he stared at Mark's mangled leg. The calf muscle was shredded, exposing glimpses of white bone beneath the torn flesh. Blood pulsed from the wound in alarming quantities, pooling on the deck beneath him. Mark's vision swam, the edges darkening as shock began to set in. He was vaguely aware of Joe frantically wrapping something tight around his upper leg, a makeshift tourniquet using a belt. "Hang on, Mark! Just hang on!" Joe's voice seemed to come from very far away as he scrambled to the console, starting the engine with trembling hands. The boat lurched forward, gathering speed as Joe pushed the throttle to its limit. The sudden movement sent fresh waves of agony through Mark's leg, drawing a strangled cry from his throat. "Stay with me, brother," Joe kept shouting, dividing his attention between steering and glancing back at Mark. 10 minutes to shore, 10 minutes. You stay awake, you hear me?" Mark tried to respond, but his mouth felt stuffed with cotton. He focused on breathing, on staying conscious, even as his body began to shiver uncontrollably despite the oppressive heat. He recognized the symptoms of blood loss and shock from his Coast Guard training years ago. Through the fog of pain, Mark watched the dark shape of the bull shark following in their wake for several hundred yards, before finally turning away, disappearing into the deeper water. The predator had simply been doing what millions of years of evolution had designed it to do: investigate, attack, feed. There was no malice in its actions, no vendetta. Mark had entered its domain, had resembled prey, and had paid the price. The journey back to the marina passed in a haze for Mark. Joe had radioed ahead, and by the time they reached the dock, EMS was waiting. Hands lifted him onto a stretcher, voices fired rapid questions at Joe, and somewhere in the commotion, Mark finally surrendered to the darkness pulling at him. He awoke to the steady beep of a heart monitor and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. Diane was beside his bed, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. When she saw he was awake, she leaned forward, grasping his hand tightly. "You stupid, stupid man," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Going into the water like that." Mark tried to speak, his throat painfully dry. Diane quickly helped him sip water through a straw. "How bad?" he managed to ask, dreading the answer. Diane's expression told him everything before she spoke. They couldn't save all of it, Mark. The damage was too severe. His gaze traveled down to where his right leg should be, finding instead a shape under the blanket that ended abruptly below the knee. A cold numbness spread through him, more profound than any physical pain. "The doctor said you're lucky to be alive," Diane continued, wiping at fresh tears. "If Joe hadn't gotten you back so quickly, if the EMS hadn't been right there, you could have bled out." Mark let his head fall back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling as the reality of his situation began to sink in. His life had fundamentally changed in a matter of seconds. The career he'd built, the activities he loved, the person he'd always been, all of it altered irrevocably by a chance encounter with one of the ocean's most efficient predators. "Where's Joe?" he asked finally. "He's outside with Mikey. I wanted to talk to you first before—" She trailed off, glancing toward the door. "He blames himself, Mark. Says he should have stopped you from going in the water." Mark shook his head weakly. "Not his fault. My decision. My stupid decision." A soft knock interrupted them, and a doctor entered, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a serious expression. "Mr. Callahan, good to see you awake. I'm Dr. Ramirez. I performed your surgery yesterday." "Yesterday?" Mark's sense of time was completely disoriented. "You've been in and out for about 30 hours now," Diane explained. "It's Wednesday evening." Dr. Ramirez checked his vitals, then carefully explained the extent of his injuries and the procedure they'd performed. The bull shark's bite had severed major arteries and crushed bones beyond repair, necessitating the below-knee amputation. The lacerations on his side from the shark's skin were superficial by comparison, requiring only stitches. "You're very fortunate, all things considered," Dr. Ramirez concluded. "The tourniquet your brother applied probably saved your life, and we were able to preserve enough of the limb for an excellent prosthetic outcome." The word prosthetic hit Mark like a physical blow. Until that moment, some part of him had been in denial about the permanence of his condition. "How long until I can—" he began, then faltered, unsure even what to ask. "Walk again," Dr. Ramirez supplied gently. "With proper rehabilitation and a good prosthesis, many patients begin walking within 3 to 6 months. However, everyone's journey is different. You're in good physical condition otherwise, which will help significantly." After answering more questions about recovery timelines and pain management, Dr. Ramirez left them alone again. Silence filled the room as Mark processed everything. "I want to see Mikey," he said finally. Diane nodded, rising to fetch their son. She paused at the door. "He's been very brave, but he's scared, Mark. Try to be strong for him." Moments later, Mikey entered tentatively, Joe's hand on his shoulder guiding him forward. At 12, their son was at that awkward stage between boy and teenager, all gangly limbs and uncertain movements. His eyes, so like Mark's own, were wide with apprehension as they fixed on his father's face, carefully avoiding looking at the shape under the blanket. "Hey, champ," Mark said, forcing a smile. "Dad," Mikey's voice cracked. "Are you okay?" "I've been better," Mark admitted, holding out his hand. "But I'm still here, that's what matters." Mikey approached the bed, taking his father's hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Mom said a shark bit you." "Bull shark. Big one too." "Did it hurt?" The simplicity of the question nearly broke Mark's composure. "Yeah, buddy, it hurt. But I'm tough, remember." Mikey nodded solemnly. "Joey McPherson at school said his cousin got bit by a shark once, but just on his foot. He's still got a scar shaped like Florida." Despite everything, Mark found himself chuckling. "Well, my scar's going to be a bit different." "Can I see it?" Mikey asked, curiosity momentarily overcoming fear. "Not yet," Diane intervened quickly. "Dad needs to rest and heal first." Joe, who had been hanging back by the door, finally stepped forward. His face was haggard, with at least 2 days of stubble and dark circles under his eyes. "Mark, Don't," Mark cut him off. "Not your fault, we both know that. I should have—" "Enough, Joe, we can play the should-have game all day, doesn't change anything." Joe fell silent, his eyes saying what words couldn't. The brothers had always communicated as much through silence as through speech, a product of countless hours together on the water, where words often got lost in the wind and waves. As evening fell, hospital staff brought in a cot for Diane, who refused to leave his side. Mikey and Joe eventually departed, promising to return the next day. A nurse administered pain medication, and Mark drifted into an uneasy sleep, filled with dark shapes moving through water. The next morning brought a flurry of activity. A physical therapist came to discuss future rehabilitation, followed by a visit from a specialist who took measurements for a temporary prosthesis. Mark listened to their explanations and instructions with a growing sense of detachment, as if they were discussing someone else's life, someone else's future. By midday, news of the attack had spread throughout the community. His hospital room was filled with flowers and cards from friends and fellow fishermen. The local newspaper sent a reporter who seemed disappointed when Mark declined to be interviewed, and a marine biology student from the nearby university left a message, asking if he would be willing to describe the shark's behavior for a research project. "Vultures," Diane muttered after turning away yet another visitor. "Can't they leave you in peace?" "They mean well," Mark said, though he was grateful for her protectiveness. The constant stream of visitors was exhausting, each one requiring him to relive the attack in some way. Later that afternoon, 2 uniformed officers from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission arrived. They introduced themselves as Officers Martinez and Donovan, explaining that they were required to document all shark attacks for their records. "Standard procedure," Officer Martinez assured him, "helps us track patterns, identify potential problem areas." Mark recounted the incident as clearly as he could remember: the location, the shark's size and behavior, the circumstances leading to the attack. Officer Donovan took detailed notes while occasionally asking clarifying questions. "And you're certain it was a bull shark?" Officer Martinez asked. "Without a doubt," Mark replied. "Been fishing those waters my whole life. I know a bull when I see one." The officers exchanged glances. "We've had reports of increased bull shark activity in that area recently," Officer Donovan said. "There's some concern about a potentially aggressive individual." Mark understood the implication immediately. "You're wondering if it was a rogue shark, one that's developed a taste for people?" "We don't use that terminology officially," Martinez said carefully. "But yes, we're investigating the possibility of a shark that's exhibiting unusually aggressive behavior toward humans." "It wasn't like that," Mark stated firmly. "I was in chest-deep water moving around, probably looked like an injured fish with that net. The shark did what sharks do, nothing rogue about it." "Still, there have been 3 incidents in that same general area in the past month," Donovan countered. 2 were minor nips, but still concerning. "So what's your plan? Hunt it down, kill it for doing what nature designed it to do?" Mark's voice had risen, drawing a concerned look from Diane. Officer Martinez raised a placating hand. "No decisions have been made. We are just gathering information at this stage, though we will be posting additional warnings at beach access points." After a few more questions, the officers left, promising to follow up if they needed anything else. Their visit left Mark unsettled. The thought of a shark being hunted down because of what happened to him didn't sit right, even as he lay in a hospital bed missing part of his leg because of that same creature. "You're defending the thing that tried to eat you," Diane observed after the officers departed. There was no judgment in her tone, just a weary acceptance of her husband's nature. "It wasn't personal," Mark said, staring out the window at the sliver of ocean visible in the distance. "The shark was just being a shark." "Tell that to your leg," she replied, but she reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. The following days passed in a blur of medical procedures, pain management, and brief, exhausting sessions with the physical therapist. Mark learned the basics of caring for his residual limb, as they called it, a clinical term that felt wholly inadequate to describe the abrupt ending of his leg, with its neat surgical scar and lingering phantom sensations. 5 days after the attack, Dr. Ramirez deemed him stable enough for discharge. The prospect of returning home filled Mark with a complicated mix of relief and apprehension. The hospital, for all its discomforts, had provided a buffer between him and the reality of his new life. A hospital aide helped him into a wheelchair, a humiliating experience for a man who had prided himself on physical self-sufficiency, and rolled him to the hospital entrance, where Diane waited with their SUV. The transfer from wheelchair to vehicle was awkward and painful, requiring both the aide and Diane to support him. As they drove through familiar streets toward home, Mark was struck by how normal everything looked. The same shops, the same traffic lights, the same beach access points with their colorful umbrellas and sunbathers. The world had continued, unchanged, while his personal universe had been completely upended. They passed Callahan's Bait and Tackle, where a small crowd of regular customers was gathered outside. Joe had put up a banner reading, "Get well soon, Mark." Someone had added a crude drawing of a shark with a red circle and slash through it. "Joe's organized a benefit for next weekend," Diane informed him following his gaze, "to help with the medical bills." Mark nodded, a lump forming in his throat. The gesture was touching, but it also drove home the financial reality they now faced. Even with insurance, the medical expenses would be substantial, not to mention the cost of prosthetics and ongoing physical therapy. And how would he work? His livelihood depended on physical labor and mobility on unstable boat decks. When they arrived home, Mikey was waiting on the porch with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Winters, who had volunteered to stay with him. The boy ran to the car as it pulled into the driveway, his face a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "Dad, I fixed up your room like Mom said. Put the TV in there and everything." "Thanks, buddy," Mark said, mustering a smile. He dreaded the next part, getting from the car to the house, a distance that once would have taken seconds, but now loomed like a marathon. Diane retrieved a pair of crutches from the trunk, unfamiliar implements that Mark had practiced with briefly in the hospital, but still felt awkward using. With her help, he maneuvered out of the vehicle, balancing precariously on his remaining leg before positioning the crutches under his arms. The walk to the front door was slow and painful, each movement sending jolts of discomfort through his healing stump. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the short distance. Mikey hovered nearby, clearly wanting to help but unsure how. Inside, the house had been rearranged to accommodate his new limitations. The living room couch had been pushed back to create a wider pathway. A temporary bed had been set up in the dining room, saving him from navigating the stairs to their bedroom. The bathroom door had been removed for easier access, and a shower chair waited beside the tub. These practical adjustments, made with love and care, nevertheless served as stark reminders of how profoundly his life had changed. Mark lowered himself onto the makeshift bed, exhaustion overwhelming him from the short journey from car to house. "I've got some of those pain pills the doctor prescribed," Diane offered, already heading to the kitchen where she'd arranged his medications. "And you're due for the antibiotic in about an hour." Mark nodded, closing his eyes briefly. When he opened them, Mikey was standing beside the bed holding something in his hands. "I made you this," the boy said, holding out a crudely constructed model boat fashioned from popsicle sticks and hot glue. "It's supposed to be your boat, for when you get better." Mark took the small craft, turning it over in his hands. Despite its rough construction, Mikey had captured the essence of his 18-footer, right down to the faded blue stripe along the hull. A lump formed in his throat as he realized what his son was really offering: hope and a belief that someday his father would return to the water. "It's perfect, Mikey. Thank you." His voice wavered slightly. "We'll put it somewhere special." The next week passed in a slow rhythm of medication schedules, painful physical therapy exercises, and awkward adjustments to daily routines. Simple tasks like showering or getting dressed became complex operations requiring planning and assistance. Mark's naturally independent nature chafed against these limitations, leading to moments of frustration and anger that he tried, not always successfully, to hide from Mikey. Visitors came regularly, Joe almost daily, bringing updates on the shop and the charter business he was trying to maintain in Mark's absence. Friends from the marina stopped by with casseroles and fishing stories. Pastor Williams from the community church, though Mark hadn't attended services in years. Each brought well-intentioned support, yet each visit also reinforced Mark's sense of being irreparably altered, now viewed through the lens of his injury. 10 days after returning home, Mark received an unexpected visitor. He was sitting on the back porch staring out at the small patch of backyard that extended toward a canal connecting eventually to the intracoastal waterway when Joe's truck pulled up. But it wasn't Joe who emerged from the passenger side. It was Ray Simmons, a marine biologist from the Coastal Research Center located about 20 miles north. Mark had met Ray a few times over the years, usually when the scientist was seeking information from local fishermen about marine conditions or species sightings. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, with the perpetual tan of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion," Ray said, as Joe helped him carry what looked like research equipment onto the porch. "Joe mentioned you were going stir-crazy. Thought you might appreciate a distraction." "What kind of distraction involves all that?" Mark gestured toward the cases Ray was setting down. "Well, I heard about your encounter from the FWC report," Ray explained, opening one of the cases to reveal a laptop and what appeared to be scanning equipment. "Been studying bull shark behavior in these waters for about 15 years now. Thought you might be interested in some context for what happened to you." Mark's interest was piqued despite himself. "What kind of context?" Ray settled into a chair across from Mark, while Joe mumbled something about checking on something in the garage, tactfully giving them space. "I've been tracking a population of bulls that use the inlet as a nursery ground," Ray began, opening his laptop. "They're fascinating creatures, one of the few shark species that can tolerate both saltwater and freshwater. Did you know they've been found more than 2,000 miles up the Mississippi River? Mark nodded. I've pulled them from Lake Okeechobee before. Mean as hell in the fresh water, too. Exactly, their adaptability is remarkable. Ray pulled up a map on his computer, showing the inlet where Mark had been attacked. This particular area has seen an increase in bull shark activity. Over the past 5 years, we believe it's related to changing water temperatures and prey distributions. The FWC guys mentioned increased activity. Something about a rogue shark. Ray's expression soured. That terminology is problematic and unscientific. There's no such thing as a rogue shark that develops a taste for humans or deliberately targets people. That's Jaws nonsense. That's what I told them, Mark said. I was in its territory splashing around. Probably looked like an injured mullet. Exactly. Bulls are opportunistic predators with poor eyesight. They rely heavily on their electroreceptors to detect prey, and in murky or turbulent water, it's easy for them to mistake human activity for food. Ray clicked through several images of bull sharks, their stocky bodies and blunt snouts immediately recognizable to Mark. This one was big, Mark recalled, 8 feet at least. Likely a mature female then, Ray nodded. The females grow larger than males, typically up to about 11 feet. They also tend to be more aggressive, especially if they're pregnant or have pups nearby. For the next hour, Ray shared his research on bull shark behavior, migration patterns, and interactions with humans. He showed Mark tracking data from tagged sharks, revealing how they moved through the inlets and canals of the area with surprising regularity. Some of the sharks had been monitored for years, their movements creating distinct patterns that corresponded with seasonal changes. And prey availability. The bull that bit you was just doing what millions of years of evolution has programmed it to do, Ray concluded. Wrong place, wrong time for both of you. Mark appreciated the scientist's matter-of-fact approach. Unlike many visitors who treated him with kid gloves or excessive sympathy, Ray spoke to him as a fellow professional with valuable experience to share. The FWC officers seemed concerned about multiple incidents in the area, Mark said. Any truth to that? Ray sighed, closing his laptop. There have been more encounters than usual this season, yes, but encounter is the key word. Most were minor, a nip and retreat when the shark realized the human wasn't appropriate prey. But they're considering some kind of response. There's always pressure after a serious attack. Politicians, tourism boards, they want visible action even if it's not scientifically sound. Ray's frustration was evident. Shark culls don't work. They're ecological disasters and don't improve public safety. Mark gestured toward his missing lower leg. Hard to argue with people who think removing the threat is the answer, and yet here you are defending the species that took your leg. Ray gave him an appraising look. Not everyone would have that perspective. They fell silent for a moment, the only sounds the distant calls of gulls and the gentle lapping of water against the canal bulkhead. I've got something else to show you, Ray said finally, reaching for another case. Thought it might help. With your recovery. Mentally at least. He opened the case to reveal what looked like a sophisticated camera with a cylindrical attachment. This is a 3D scanner. With your permission, I'd like to scan the bite pattern on your residual limb. It could help with our research on bull shark feeding behavior and bite mechanics. Mark was taken aback by the request. You want to scan my stump? Only if you're comfortable with it, Ray assured him quickly. The data would be anonymized in any publications, but bite analysis is one of the most valuable tools we have for understanding shark behavior during attacks. Mark considered the request. There was something both clinical and intimate about it. Having the wound that had so dramatically altered his life documented for scientific study, yet the idea that his experience might contribute to better understanding these creatures held a certain appeal. Will it hurt? He asked practically. Not at all, you won't feel a thing, just need to remove any bandages. And hold still for about 5 minutes. After a moment's further consideration, Mark nodded. All right, let's do it. With Diane's help, who had returned from grocery shopping during their conversation, Mark removed the protective sock and bandaging from his residual limb. The healing incision was a stark line across the end of his stump, still red and tender-looking, despite the surgeon's skilled work. Around this main incision were the distinctive puncture marks from the shark's teeth, now sealed but clearly visible, in a curved pattern that matched the jaw structure of a bull shark. Ray worked efficiently, scanning the limb from multiple angles while explaining the technology. The scanner creates a 3D model that we can analyze for tooth spacing, penetration depth, and bite force. Each shark species has distinctive bite patterns. Bulls have unique dental morphology. Their teeth are triangular and heavily serrated in the upper jaw, but narrower in the lower jaw. Mark watched with a strange detachment as the image of his own mutilated leg appeared on Ray's laptop screen, rendered in detailed 3D. There was something almost validating about seeing the scientific record of what had happened to him, objective evidence of his encounter with one of nature's most perfectly evolved predators. "Thank you for this," Ray said sincerely as he finished the scan and helped Mark rebandage the limb. "Your contribution will help us better understand these animals, which ultimately helps with conservation and public safety both." After Ray left, promising to send Mark copies of any research that used his case, Mark remained on the porch, lost in thought. Joe, who had tactfully made himself scarce during the scanning, rejoined him with 2 beers, handing one to Mark. "Thought that might have been weird," Joe commented, "but figured it might do you good to talk to someone who understands what actually happened out there." Mark took a long pull from the beer. "He's right, you know, about the shark just doing what sharks do." "Still doesn't make it fair," Joe replied. "Fair's got nothing to do with it." Mark gazed out toward the canal, where a blue heron was stalking fish in the shallows. "Nature isn't fair, it just is." They sat in companionable silence, watching the heron strike successfully, lifting a small fish in its beak. Predator and prey, the eternal dance that governed the natural world, played out before them in miniature. That night, Mark dreamed of the ocean, not of the attack as he had numerous times since it happened, but of swimming freely through clear blue water, whole and unafraid. In the distance, dark shapes moved with fluid grace, neither threatening nor retreating, simply existing in their element as he existed in his. He woke with tear tracks on his face, a sense of loss so profound it felt like a physical weight on his chest. Beside him, Diane stirred. "Bad dream," she murmured sleepily. "No," he whispered. "Good one, actually." 3 weeks after the attack, Mark visited the prosthetics specialist for the first fitting of his temporary prosthesis. The appointment was both exciting and daunting, a tangible step toward regaining mobility, but also a stark reminder of the permanence of his condition. The prosthetist, a cheerful woman named Lisa with a no-nonsense manner, explained each component as she assembled the device. "This is just your training prosthesis," she emphasized. "Once the swelling in your residual limb stabilizes, usually around 6 to 12 months post-surgery, we'll fit you for a definitive one with more advanced features." Mark examined the prosthesis with mixed emotions. The socket, designed to fit over his stump, was connected to a metal pylon that ended in a basic foot component. It looked clinical and foreign, nothing like the flesh and bone it was meant to replace. With Lisa's assistance, he donned the prosthesis for the first time, a process that involved securing his residual limb in the socket with a gel liner and suspension system. Standing up with it was an odd sensation. The artificial limb bore his weight, but provided none of the sensory feedback he was accustomed to. "Take a few steps," Lisa encouraged, staying close. "It'll feel strange at first." Strange was an understatement. Mark felt off balance and unsure, like walking on a boat deck in high seas, except the motion was coming from within his own body rather than the environment. The prosthetic foot didn't flex like a natural one, requiring him to adjust his gait in ways that felt deeply unnatural. After 20 minutes of practice, he was sweating profusely, and his remaining leg ached from compensating for the awkward movements. But he had successfully walked the length of the training room several times, each circuit becoming marginally easier than the last. "You're doing great," Lisa assured him. "Much better than most first-timers. Your core strength from all those years on boats is paying off." Mark wasn't convinced, but he appreciated her encouragement. "How long until it feels normal?" Lisa's expression was compassionate but honest. "That varies widely from person to person. The physical adjustment might take months. The psychological adjustment, accepting the prosthesis as part of you, that can take longer." On the drive home, Mark stared out the window at the familiar coastal landscape, the prosthesis now stored in the trunk. The brief session had left him physically exhausted, but mentally energized. For the first time since the attack, he could envision a future where he wasn't defined by what he had lost, but by how he adapted to his new reality. "Lisa said I'm making good progress," he told Diane. "Better than average." Of course you are, Diane replied with a small smile. You're too stubborn to do otherwise. That stubborn determination became Mark's driving force over the subsequent weeks. He threw himself into rehabilitation with the same single-minded focus he had once applied to perfecting his fishing techniques. Each day, he spent hours practicing with the prosthesis, gradually increasing his endurance and stability. The persistent, phantom sensations, sometimes pain, sometimes just awareness of a limb that was no longer there, became a strange companion to his efforts. Some days he could almost feel his missing foot flexing as he attempted to walk normally. Other days, intense nerve pain from the severed pathways would force him back to crutches, a frustrating reminder of the long road ahead. 6 weeks after the attack, Mark insisted on visiting the marina. Joe had been managing his charter bookings, referring clients to other captains while maintaining Mark's portion of the business on paper, but Mark needed to see the operation for himself, needed to smell the salt air and diesel fuel that had been the backdrop to his entire professional life. The familiar sights and sounds of the marina hit him with unexpected force as Joe helped him from the truck. Gulls wheeled overhead, their harsh cries mingling with the clanking of halyards against masts and the rhythmic slap of water against hulls. Several fishermen recognized him, calling out greetings that carried both welcome and the slight awkwardness of people unsure how to address his injury. Captain Mike Donovan, whose slip was adjacent to Mark's, approached with a gruff handshake. "Damn good to see you up and about, Callahan. Doc's been too quiet without your ugly mug around." "Been too quiet at home too," Mark replied with a genuine smile. "Diane's about ready to throw me back to the Sharks just for some peace." The joke, the first he'd made about the attack, caught both men by surprise, but after a moment's hesitation, Donovan laughed heartily. "That woman's a saint for putting up with you this long." They made their way down the dock, Mark moving slowly but determinedly on his prosthesis, using a cane for additional support. Joe hovered nearby, ready to assist if needed, but respecting Mark's determination to manage on his own. Mark's boat, the Linda Marie, named for his mother, was moored in its usual slip, looking freshly washed and maintained. Joe had clearly been taking good care of it during his absence. "Engine repairs finally got done," Joe informed him. "Runs better than new now." Mark ran his hand along the gunnel, feeling the familiar texture of the fiberglass under his palm. "You been taking her out?" "Couple times a week, just to keep the systems running." "Did those 2 corporate charters that were booked before?" Joe trailed off, not needing to complete the thought. Mark nodded, appreciating his brother's efforts to keep the business viable. "Any bites on selling her?" The question was difficult to voice, but necessary. They'd listed the boat for sale 3 weeks prior, a decision Mark had made with reluctant pragmatism. Between the medical bills and the uncertainty of when or if he could return to charter fishing, keeping the boat didn't make financial sense. "A few inquiries, nothing serious yet," Joe replied, watching him carefully. "We can take the listing down if you've changed your mind." Mark shook his head. "No, it's the right call." He patted the boat's side one more time, then turned away. "Just wanted to see her again." As they walked back toward the marina office, a commotion at the cleaning station caught their attention. A group of tourists on a chartered fishing trip were returning with their catch, excitedly photographing what appeared to be a small shark laid out on the cleaning table. "Is that a bull?" Mark asked, changing direction to get a better look. Joe squinted. "Looks like a blacktip to me, young one." They approached the cleaning station where Captain Sam Reynolds was preparing to fillet the shark for his clients. Reynolds spotted them and waved them over. "Mark Callahan! Man, it's good to see you." He stepped away from the cleaning table to shake Mark's hand. "Heard? You were on the mend." Getting there, Mark confirmed, his attention on the shark. It was indeed a blacktip, not a bull, about 4 feet long, its distinctive black-tipped fins identifying the species clearly. "Nice catch. Folks wanted shark for dinner," Reynolds explained with a shrug. "This one hit a bonito we were bringing in, legal size, so..." He gestured to the tourists, who were still snapping photos, clearly thrilled with their exotic trophy. Mark studied the shark, taking in its sleek form, the perfectly hydrodynamic shape honed by millions of years of evolution. Even in death, there was something impressive about the predator, a rugged, primitive beauty that spoke to its mastery of its environment. "Got one that looks just like it," Mark said, tapping his prosthetic leg with his cane. The comment drew startled looks from Reynolds and the tourists, followed by uncertain laughter. "Jesus, Mark," Joe muttered, but there was admiration in his tone for his brother's ability to joke about his trauma. Mark smiled, but his eyes remained on the shark. In that moment, he felt an unexpected kinship with the creature, both of them subject to forces beyond their control, both simply trying to survive in their respective worlds. The shark had lost its life pursuing food, following instinct. Mark had lost his leg doing the same in a way, pursuing his livelihood in waters he knew held danger. The encounter at the marina marked a turning point in Mark's recovery, not just physically, but psychologically. The ability to joke about the attack, to look at another shark without triggering panic or resentment, represented a significant step in his acceptance process. It also rekindled his connection to the maritime community that had been his extended family for decades. A world he feared might have been lost to him along with his leg. In the months that followed, Mark's progress continued steadily, if not always smoothly. There were setbacks, infections that delayed healing, days when phantom pain made using the prosthesis unbearable, moments of depression when the full impact of his altered future hit him anew. But there were triumphs too. The first time he walked unassisted across the living room, the afternoon he managed to climb the 3 steps to Joe's front porch, the morning he put on jeans over his prosthesis and looked in the mirror to see a semblance of his former self. 8 months after the attack, Mark received his definitive prosthesis, a more sophisticated model with an articulated ankle joint that allowed for greater natural movement. The prosthetist had worked closely with him to design a limb suited to his active lifestyle, with components that could better withstand exposure to sand and salt water. "This isn't quite ready for deep-sea fishing," Lisa cautioned, as she fitted to the new prosthesis, "but for day-to-day activities, including light boating, it should serve you well." Mark tested the new limb, marveling at the difference from his temporary prosthesis. His gait was smoother, more natural, the movements requiring less conscious thought. "What about swimming?" he asked, a question he had avoided until now. Lisa considered this. "Swimming is actually excellent exercise for amputees. The water provides natural buoyancy and resistance. You'll need to remove the prosthesis, of course, and there are special water-specific prosthetics if you become serious about it." The thought of returning to the water, the same environment that had taken his leg, had been both compelling and terrifying to Mark. He hadn't so much as dipped a toe in since the attack, not even in the backyard pool that Diane used regularly. The idea of being vulnerable again, with limited mobility in the shark's domain, awakened a primal fear he rarely acknowledged. Yet something in him yearned for that reconnection. The ocean had been his second home for almost 4 decades. Its absence in his life left a void that fishing from shore or going out on others' boats couldn't fill. That evening, after dinner, Mark sat on their back porch overlooking the small pool and the canal beyond. Diane joined him, handing him a beer as she settled into the adjacent chair. "Penny for your thoughts," she said after a comfortable silence. Mark took a sip before answering, thinking about swimming again. Diane's expression remained carefully neutral. "In the pool?" "Eventually in the ocean." Now her composure slipped slightly, concern flickering across her features. "Mark, not tomorrow," he assured her. "Not next week or even next month, but someday." She studied him for a long moment. "Because you need to, or because you think you have something to prove?" It was a fair question, one Mark had been asking himself. "Both, maybe. The ocean's been part of my life since before I could walk. I don't want that taken from me too." Diane reached for his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I can't go." "Through that again, Mark. Getting that call from Joe, not knowing if you were even alive, it's—" "I promise," he said, squeezing her hand. "No unnecessary risks." 2 weeks later, Mark took his first tentative steps back into the water, not the ocean, but the controlled environment of their backyard pool. He sat on the edge, residual limb exposed without the prosthesis, and slowly lowered himself into the shallow end. The sensation was both familiar and strange. The water embraced him as it always had, but his body responded differently now, the missing limb creating an imbalance he had to consciously compensate for. Using his arms and remaining leg, he pushed away from the wall, floating on his back, in the center of the pool. Looking up at the sky, feeling the water support him, Mark experienced a profound sense of reconnection, not just with the element he loved, but with a part of himself he feared had been lost with his leg. He wasn't the same man who had entered the ocean that fateful day almost 9 months ago. He never would be again. But perhaps this new version of himself could still find joy and purpose in the water, albeit in different ways. Over the next several weeks, Mark developed a swimming routine, gradually building strength and confidence. He learned to compensate for the missing limb, discovering that his years of swimming experience gave him an advantage even with the disability. The pool became a place of rehabilitation and redemption, a controlled reintroduction to the aquatic world. 10 months after the attack, Mark made a decision. He called Ray Simmons, the marine biologist who had scanned his injury and kept in intermittent contact since then. "I want to go back to where it happened," Mark said without preamble when Ray answered. "Not in the water, just on a boat, to see the spot again." There was a pause before Ray responded. "That's a significant step, Mark. Are you sure you're ready?" "No," Mark admitted, "but I need to do it anyway." They arranged to meet the following weekend at the marina. Ray would bring his research vessel, a modified 26-foot center console equipped with various scientific instruments. Joe insisted on joining them, as did Diane, despite Mark's initial reluctance to have her witness what might be a difficult emotional experience. The morning of the trip dawned clear and calm, with light offshore winds creating ideal conditions on the water. Mark arrived at the marina early, taking time to mentally prepare himself for what lay ahead. He had slept poorly the night before, his dreams filled with dark water and shadowy figures, but his resolve remained firm. Ray's boat was already in the slip when Mark, Diane, and Joe arrived. The scientist greeted them warmly, helping Mark aboard with practiced ease, clearly accustomed to accommodating people with mobility challenges during his research expeditions. "I've brought some equipment I thought might interest you," Ray said, gesturing to several cases secured to the deck, including a hydrophone so we can listen to any sharks in the area, and a side-scan sonar that might let us spot them without getting in the water. Mark appreciated the thoughtfulness, recognizing that Ray was offering both educational distraction and practical safety measures for their journey. As they pulled away from the dock, Mark felt a familiar tension in his shoulders, the same apprehension he used to experience before diving in particularly challenging conditions. His prosthetic leg, now a familiar weight, was securely attached, though he had brought his crutches as a precaution against fatigue or instability on the moving vessel. The trip to the North Inlet took approximately 20 minutes. Mark stood at the bow for most of the journey, one hand gripping the rail, eyes fixed on the horizon. The coastline looked as it always had, a ribbon of white sand separating azure water from the patchwork of coastal development. Seabirds wheeled overhead, pelicans skimmed the surface for fish, and the occasional dolphin fin broke the water in the distance. Nature continued its rhythms, indifferent to the small human dramas that played out within its vast domain. As they approached the inlet, Ray slowed the boat, checking GPS coordinates against his notes. "We're getting close to the location you described," he informed Mark, who nodded silently, scanning the water with an intensity that suggested he was seeing not just what was there now, but what had been there that day. "Right about here," Mark finally said, pointing to a spot approximately 50 yards from the narrow beach. "We were anchored just about here when I went in after the net." Ray cut the engine, allowing the boat to drift gently in the light current. The water was clear today, visibility extending perhaps 15 feet below the surface. Small fish darted beneath them, their silver sides catching the sunlight as they moved. For several long minutes, no one spoke. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the hull, the distant calls of gulls, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. Mark gripped the rail tightly, his knuckles white with tension, but his expression remained composed. "You okay?" Joe asked quietly, moving to stand beside his brother. Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah, different than I expected. It's just water, just a place." Ray had been setting up some of his equipment, and now approached with what looked like a specialized microphone attached to a cable. "This is the hydrophone," he explained. "It picks up sounds underwater that human ears can't normally detect. Sharks are actually quite vocal in their way, not like dolphins, but they make distinctive sounds, especially when hunting or interacting with each other." He lowered the device into the water, connecting it to a small amplifier. Immediately, the quiet was filled with the surprisingly complex soundscape of the underwater environment, the clicking and popping of crustaceans, the whoosh of water currents, the distant rumble of a boat engine somewhere beyond the inlet. Listen for lower frequency sounds, Ray instructed, adjusting some settings. Bull sharks often produce a sort of low grunting when they're there. Hear that? Mark focused on the sounds emanating from the speaker. Among the aquatic white noise, he detected something deeper, more rhythmic, a series of low pulses that seemed to emanate from somewhere beyond their immediate vicinity. That's a bull, he asked, leaning closer to the speaker. Ray nodded. Almost certainly, from the sound pattern, I'd say it's a female, probably around 7 to 8 feet, cruising, not hunting actively. There was something profoundly affecting about hearing, the presence of the creature that had so dramatically altered his life. Not the same individual, of course. Ray had explained that sharks typically didn't maintain defined territories for long periods, but the same species, perhaps even part of the same local population. They're always out there, Mark said softly. Always have been, always will be. We're the visitors. Ray nodded approvingly. That's exactly right. We've documented bull sharks in these waters, going back to the earliest colonial records. They were here long before humans built on these shores, and they'll likely be here long after. For the next 2 hours, they drifted in the inlet, Ray sharing his knowledge about the local shark populations, their behaviors, and the ongoing conservation efforts to protect them despite their fearsome reputation. He showed them tracking data on his laptop, explaining how tagged sharks moved through the area in patterns that corresponded with tides, water temperature, and prey availability. Mark absorbed it all with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed his own extensive knowledge of local marine life. The tension that had marked his features upon arrival gradually eased, replaced by the familiar engagement of a waterman in his element. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, Ray suggested they head back to the marina. Mark took one last long look at the water surrounding them, the place where his life had changed irreversibly, and felt a sense of closure that had eluded him until now. "Thank you for this," he told Ray as they stowed the equipment and prepared to return. It helped. "Confronting the site of trauma often does," Ray replied. "Reminds us that places aren't inherently dangerous or malevolent. They just are." On the return journey, Mark remained at the bow, but his posture was different now. More relaxed, his face turned into the salt spray with something like enjoyment. Diane stood beside him, her arm linked through his, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering concern. "I was so afraid this would set you back," she admitted quietly, "that seeing the place again would bring it all back too vividly." "It did bring it back," Mark said, "but not in the way I expected. Being here, seeing how normal everything is, hearing Ray talk about the sharks like they're just another part of the ecosystem, it helps put things in perspective." "And what perspective is that?" Mark considered the question as he watched a ray leap from the water in the distance, its wings spread like a bird in momentary flight before disappearing beneath the surface again. That what happened to me wasn't personal, it wasn't fate or punishment or bad luck, really. It was just nature. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing something risky in an environment where risks have consequences. Diane leaned her head against his shoulder. "That's a very philosophical view from a man who used to say, 'Shit happens whenever anything went wrong.'" Mark laughed, the sound carrying across the water. "Maybe losing a leg makes a man philosophical." As they neared the marina, Joe joined them at the bow. "So what now? You seemed pretty at peace out there." Mark hadn't shared his evolving plans with either his brother or wife yet, uncertain himself until today whether they were realistic or merely the desperate grasping of a man trying to reclaim his former life. "I've been talking to Mike Donovan," he said, referring to their fellow charter captain. "He's looking for a first mate, someone who knows the waters, can handle the customers, but doesn't necessarily need to haul nets or wrestle with the big game fish." Joe's eyebrows rose. "You're going to work for Mike." "With Mike," Mark corrected. "Partnership arrangement. He provides the boat and the heavy lifting. I provide the local knowledge and customer experience. Split the profit 60-40 until I get my sea legs back, so to speak." "Why didn't you come to me?" Joe asked, a hint of hurt in his voice. "I could have worked something out with the shop." "Because you'd give me too good a deal," Mark replied honestly. "You'd take the hit to help me out. Mike's a friend, but he's business first. The arrangement only works if I pull my weight." Joe considered this, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. When do you start?" "Next month, if everything goes according to plan. Got to get certified in some safety procedures first, given the, he gestured to his prosthetic leg, special circumstances. Diane had been listening silently, her expression unreadable. Now she spoke, her voice carefully measured. You're going back on the water professionally, after everything that happened. It wasn't quite a question, but Mark answered it as one. Yes, it's who I am, Di. I can't let the shark take that from me, too. She held his gaze for a long moment before nodding almost imperceptibly. Just promise me you'll stay in the boat this time. No more wading in after nets or anything else. I promise, Mark said solemnly, then added with a small smile. Besides, Mike already made that a condition of our agreement. Said he's not having a one-legged first mate getting any more parts bitten off on his watch. The tension broke as both Joe and Diane laughed, and even Ray, overhearing from the helm, joined in. The sound of their laughter carried across the water as the boat glided into the marina, returning Mark to the world of docks and vessels that had been his lifelong home. That night, after Diane had gone to bed, Mark sat alone on the back porch, gazing out at the canal where the moonlight created a silver path across the dark water. In his hand, he held the small model boat Mikey had made for him during those first difficult days of recovery, a talisman of sorts that had sat on his bedside table through the worst of the pain and adjustment. He thought about the bull shark. That had attacked him, now long gone from the inlet where their paths had crossed so catastrophically. The scientist in Ray would say the shark had simply continued its instinctual patterns, hunting, mating, perhaps bearing pups that now swam the same waters. It had no capacity to remember the human it had bitten, no concept of the life it had irrevocably altered. And yet, Mark felt a strange connection to the creature, a shared experience that linked them across the divide of species and consciousness. For a brief, violent moment, they had been the most intimate of strangers, predator and prey, their lives intersecting in a contest as old as life in the sea. Mark raised his gaze to the horizon, where the distant line between ocean and sky was barely discernible in the darkness. Out there, beyond sight but present nonetheless, the bull shark that had taken his leg continued its ancient journey through waters it had mastered long before humans walked the earth. And here, on the edge of those same waters, Mark prepared to continue his own journey, altered but undefeated, changed but not diminished. Tomorrow he would call Mike Donovan to finalize their arrangement. The day after, he would begin the specialized safety training required for his new role. And soon he would return to the ocean professionally, not as the same man who had left it on a stretcher 10 months ago, but as someone who had faced its darkest peril and emerged with a deeper understanding of both its dangers and its gifts. The shark would continue being a shark, following the imperatives of its nature without malice or mercy. And Mark Callahan would continue being a waterman, respecting the sea and its creatures, but refusing to surrender to fear of them. It was, he reflected as he carefully set Mikey's model boat back on the table beside him, perhaps the most natural conclusion to their brief, violent encounter, each returning to their element, forever changed yet fundamentally the same.